These two towers could be thought of as the birthplace of the penthouse apartment in Manhattan and possibly the world. I'm Nick Potts, I'm an architect, and today we're going to be doing a walking tour of Manhattan's Upper West Side. Something that was happening almost uniquely here on the Upper West Side. At the turn of the century, it was becoming a neighborhood where people coming from other places who were on the make were looking for places to live. And the apartment hotel really was the solution for this. These apartments didn't have kitchens, and so they looked like an apartment. People would live in them for a long time, but anything dealing with service was centralized. You never had to cross paths with staff. We're in the 20th century here. There's electricity on the street, there are subways, so it's starting to get a little bit more buzzing, and the hubbub of Broadway was becoming an appeal. The big idea of these apartment hotels to attract the upwardly mobile middle class was a thing that was happening here on the Upper West Side uniquely. And buildings like this were starting to pop up as kind of this new nexus of an apartment hotel neighborhood. Right now we're in front of the Dakota. This is really one of the first buildings on the Upper West Side. The name, the Dakota, was a bit of a joke because it was so remote, both so far west and so far north, that it may as well be in the Dakotas, which weren't even states yet. And the building is fairly experimental in terms of its location and also its technology. A building of this height needed elevators. And to have elevators, you have to have electricity, which didn't exist here on the Upper West Side until the subways were run in 1900. It was the heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune who developed this building. He provided his own power plant and really embarked on an almost experimental folly. The Dakota really was the pioneer of making apartment living for the upwardly mobile middle class acceptable and something that would attract more residents and ultimately more buildings. And this was a middle class building. And the middle class that existed in the 1880s when this was built was very different than what we have now. People had staffs. People were expected to have like a certain level of wealth to buy into this. At the same time, again, apartment living is new, and the idea of living next to someone rather than having your own individual house and having to cross paths with their staff was still something that a lot of people were trying to get behind. So in a building like the Dakota, there was a huge amount of planning put into the separation of front of house and back of house. So underneath the courtyard of the Dakota, there's an entire level of service. And so the servants using the area beneath the courtyard would essentially never have to cross paths with the building's residents. One of the most interesting things about the Dakota is that there are no corridors. There are these 4 separate passenger towers that led to these enormous apartments that essentially bridged an entire corner of the building before they went to the service towers that were in the center. So at the time the Dakota was under construction, apartment building design was still very modular, where people were taking, as many rooms as they needed, where it was a suite of 3 salons or something with an entire residence. And that was really appealing to people who were trying to establish themselves. If you think about the movie Rosemary's Baby, that this obviously starred prominently in, the crux of the situation with the homeowners is that it's a combined apartment with a shared closet. Stylistically, the Dakota is also a pioneer or an outlier in many ways. It was designed by Henry Hardenbergh, who eventually designed the Plaza Hotel in 1907. It's pretty unique in that it's a Germanic medieval style building. It almost looks like a civic building that you would see go up in the middle of Europe in the 1850s or 1860s, like a post office or a city hall. So there's a monumentality to it. And the building even has a moat if you look around it, which wasn't meant to be like a castle. It was meant to bring light in, but it continues the theme of this fortress-like Northern European medieval sort of architecture. This odd Germanic style really wasn't adopted elsewhere in the Upper West Side, but the planning of the Dakota became a really important pattern. And you look at buildings like the Apthorpe and the Belnor that have a very similar sort of planning. No corridors, separate elevator towers, the central courtyard. You see the pattern of the Dakota really taking root uniquely in the Upper West Side. And as other developments happened, particularly a few blocks further west on Broadway, they mimicked the sorts of amenity spaces that the Dakota had, while in a more approachable sort of building, the apartment hotel. This building behind me is the Hotel Belclair, which is important for 2 major reasons. The first is that it was the first major commission by Emery Roth, who was the architect of the San Remo, the El Dorado, the Beresford, really the most iconic buildings on Central Park West. It's also important because it's emblematic of a new building type, which is the apartment hotel. And this is a type that emerged really here on the Upper West Side to suit the needs of an on-the-make upper middle class. So because in this time period, the mixing of residents and staff was a really important deal, a lot of the planning of these buildings was around the separation of service service and living. And there's always a service elevator. The functions like the kitchens and the servants' rooms and quarters are always centered towards the center of the building, usually around a light court to kind of stay away from the salons and the kind of the high value spaces which are lining the public face of the building. And a building like this, though it served the needs of the upper middle class, it really wasn't something that people on the east side looked well upon, where the old money lived in their kind of proper limestone or brownstone buildings with kind of restrained ornament. A building like this appealed to the West Side taste. These are people who are on the make. The excess was appealing to them and not considered garish or in poor taste. This building is really a unique example in New York of the Viennese secession / Art Nouveau style. You see a lot more of this experimentation on the West Side because this is targeted to people who are on the make and they're looking to impress. And the more ornament, the more stuff added to it, it appeals to people who are kind of looking to make their way up. So this building was going up at exactly the same time as two other major apartment hotels along Broadway, a few blocks further south, the ANSONIA, which is the largest and probably the most iconic of these, and the DORILTON, which is similar in terms of scale and form to what you see on the Belclaire, but taller and a little more French in planning. But the idea is the same. It's a corner buildings targeted towards an apartment hotel that was meant to attract people who were moving to the city and establishing themselves. Behind me is the ANSONIA, and this was built in 1904. The reason why there's a proliferation of these large apartment buildings here at 72nd Street and Broadway is right underneath it. And you can see the 72nd Street IRT subway station. This was right around the same time, around 1901, 1902. And because of this, there's electrification and the means of people to get from further downtown up here. So the land value skyrocketed and it was natural to build a large building. So this is another apartment hotel. It's the largest of any of these. There were 300 suites when this was built. Stylistically, it's French Beaux-Arts. Stokes, who was the developer of the ANSONIA, hired an architect from Paris, Paul Dubois, to design essentially a Haussmannian building. This is very similar to what you see in the 8th arrondissement in Paris with the French balconies and the band courses, but it's blown up to an enormous scale, almost 3 times what you would see in Paris, where the buildings are 5-6 stories. He was also so involved that the architect ended up just leaving the country. He paid him off to go back to France, and Stokes essentially took over the building as his folly and kind of lavished money on it. There were Turkish baths, there were shopping arcades. Really, it was an apartment hotel, but it had all of what you'd expect in a 5-star hotel now. The building failed really quickly after it was built. It built in 1904. By the time the 1930s came around, the kitchens were already closed. So it went through a really rapid change in the types of people that it housed. It declined significantly during the 1970s, and it really became in the 1970s almost a flop house in poor repair. But because it was very well built, again, this was Stokes' folly. He poured a lot of money into it, which ultimately bankrupted the building. It's very robustly built. The steel is heavily fireproof with stone. The floors are actually 2 layers thick, and so it's essentially soundproof. So this actually made it a great place for musicians to live. Again, we're just up the 2-3 line from Times Square, close to Lincoln Center when that came about. So this became a great place for musicians to live and to actually live work, so they could teach classes or practice in their apartment without really bothering the neighbors. It's just really amazing to think about the number of people who are noted in terms of music and performing arts. Rachmaninoff, Mahler, Stravinsky, Florence Ziegfeld, who have lived and worked just in that one building. The Turkish baths that were in the basement of the building when it was first built obviously didn't have a use anymore. So by the time the 1970s came around, it was a gay bathhouse called the Continental Baths where Bette Midler got her start. And you can just think about its importance in establishing New York and maintaining its cachet as a cultural capital. In terms of its planning, the ANSONIA is a departure from earlier apartment buildings such as the Dakota, where the vertical circulation was split up in multiple cores. Here, the ANSONIA actually centralizes all the elevators into one stacked core, which is the way that a lot of hotels and office towers and even residential towers are planned now. So there's a bit more forward thinking in terms of centralizing the circulation into one spine versus dispersing it into small neighborhoods. The Upper West Side was really the last place in Manhattan where townhouses were built. And what you can see is that they're extremely eclectic, containing everything from Moorish decoration, classical sculpture, and more modish sorts of arts and crafts motifs. So really interesting and individual as opposed to what you see on the East Side. So these 2 towers behind me, you could think of as being the birthplace of the penthouse in New York City and possibly even the world. It's the San Remo, this is 1930, it's Emery Roth, so barely 30 years after the construction of the Hotel Belclair. You can see the drastic changes in both the adoption of apartment living as a proper place where people live, and also architecturally the development of the apartment house into its own distinct style. The idea of the penthouse is really something that was birthed in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. When tall buildings were first thought about, the top of the building was seen as a place for equipment. This building really comes right off the heels of an earlier Emery Roth building, the Beresford, just north of the American Natural History Museum. And that building was the first to introduce towers. In the case of the Beresford, the towers were not for people to live in, they were actually for equipment. So it was the water tanks and the overruns for the elevators took up the prominent towers. What happened between the Beresford and San Remo, however, was the multiple dwelling law of 1929. And that was a state-mandated law that talked about essentially how to build an apartment tower. This law that said if you have a 100-foot-long block, the towers can be yay big and they have to be this far apart. Previously, buildings were less valuable as you got higher and higher up, but the elevator made that whole getting vertical much more seamless. And as people started realizing views, that whole idea flipped and the higher floors suddenly became more valuable because you have this added bonus and this added value of views that really hadn't been quantified before. So the towers on the San Remo are really the pinnacle of this development of a new style and type of building, which is the apartment tower.